Hey, I'm Pete McConville and this is Not So Obvious Watches, and this is my take on the Breitling releases for Watches and Wonders 2021. Yeah, I know Breitling wasn't actually part of Watches and Wonders, but their release was so close, may as well treat it that way, especially since from this particular Breitling fanboys approach view, they're probably some of the best releases going around anyway. I've done a couple of videos about Breitling in the past. I'm going to mention some ideas that you might want to go check out later. The first thing is, Breitling is a brand that is perhaps not the brand you think you know or that you remember. They're in the middle of a huge overhaul of where they've been and where they're going. As I said, I've done a couple of videos on that in the past. I'll put some links in the show notes below. In more than anything else, what they're trying to do is go back to their glory years, dump a lot of their more recent history, so a lot of the watches that you might be familiar with, and move on to something very, very different. This week with these releases, Breitling went full bell, book and candle in trying to excommunicate the last 15 years, and these watches are totally different to anything you might have seen from Breitling in the past. Okay, so before we get into looking at the actual Breitling releases for 2021, it's kind of useful for you to understand how I look at the brand, so that'll help you kind of understand how I'm analyzing these releases. So the first thing is, I would say Breitling is very definitely trying to go back to its roots, trying to banish all memories of kind of everything from the late 1990s to around about 2015. The second thing is, I think you've got to understand that Breitling is a chronograph specialist. Chronographs and Breitling go together, and you're always going to see more chronographs than you might expect. That, by the way, is where the whole instruments for professionals comes along. Breitling was created by people to create stopwatches for professionals that needed to time things. It began life making stopwatches for pocket stopwatches back in the 1870s. They produced their first wristwatch chronograph in 1904. They invented the independent pusher for starting and stopping in 1915. They likewise invented the reset button in 1923. It sounds weird to say they invented things like a reset button, doesn't it? But yeah, once upon a time, chronographs didn't have them until Breitling came along in 1923. By the 1930s, Breitling had something like 35 chronographs in their catalogue. In the 60s, they were part of that race to make the first automatic version. And then when it all nearly went dark, the lights went out and Breitling nearly died, it was chronographs like the Navitimer and the Chronomat that kept the Breitling dream alive. So really, as I said, the idea of chronographs and Breitling are inseparable. The other thing to bear in mind when you're thinking about Breitling chronographs is, if the thought ever comes to your mind that Breitling chronograph looks like XXX, insert any brand you want here, the truth is most likely the other way round. That Breguet Type 20 that you're looking at actually looks like a Breitling of the earlier era, not the Breitling looks like a Breguet, for example. Because Breitling for so long have been a little bit off Broadway, people have kind of lost track of just how important they were back in their heyday. Okay, so all of that done, the last thing to mention is, in analysing Breitling releases, you should also keep in mind what they're trying to achieve today. So as well as going back to their roots, they're also trying to hit what George Kern has described as kind of their mantra of casual, inclusive, sustainable, and accessible. Casual basically means easier, less formal, more fun colors, materials like red gold, that sort of thing, instead of slightly stodgy things like yellow gold. Inclusive generally means color choices. We're seeing more unisex and feminine colors. We're seeing less openly machismo in marketing, and also smaller sizes. Most people picture massive 45mm plus watches when they're thinking about Breitlings, but these days there's a bunch of watches that are like 40mm and below. They really have been pouring a lot of effort into that. Sustainability basically is all backroom stuff. It's about packaging and materials, not that big a deal. Accessible is one that they've been adding a bit lately, and that's really about saying in terms of both pricing and availability. Their idea is that pricing will cap out for their normal steels at around about 10,000 US, maybe a little bit more if they're adding some more complications, more again obviously precious metals, but that's where they're aiming. Accessible also means if you want to buy a Breitling, it should be available for you. That said, there's a little rider to that. They are working really hard to stop dumping into the grey market, and you'll actually find hardly any new build Rolex Breitling, so anything since about 2017, 2018 in places like Joma Shop these days. So anyway, that's about 4 minutes of intro about who I think Breitling is and sort of the lens I look at them, look at their watches through. Okay, so now let's get into what we've got here. We've got 3 watches, all chronographs, all in the Premier collection, 2 variants of each, 1 gold, 1 steel. If you don't see the colors you want, don't worry, there will be more coming. Breitling have been making this big deal about keeping their initial launch really tight, really narrow, and really focused. And they've done this now for about 3 years. In the initial release, you get 1 or maybe 2 colors, and then they build on it later. Okay, so with all that said, now let's talk about the 3 watches that we're getting, which are the Premier Chronograph, the Premier Duograph, and the Premier Datora. Across the board, so the Premier Chronograph, simple 2-register chrono. The Duograph is a split seconds chrono, and the Datora is a calendar moon phase and chronograph. So now, the things that are common to all of them, they're all based on classic Breitling references from back in the 40s and the 50s. And the other thing I would say that is common to all of them is that they are simply gorgeous. They are wonderful modern takes on these classic 40s and 50s designs. I think the balance on the dial is perfect. I don't love those mutilated numbers, but I can kind of cope. In order to avoid it, you really only have a couple of options. You can make the numerals smaller, which I would have glad they didn't do. You can make the sub-registers smaller, which I'm glad they didn't do. You can drag the registers further in and try and crowd them around the center pinion, which I'm glad they didn't do. So if you consider all the other options to what might have happened in order to avoid mutilating the numbers, all of them are worse than having those cutoff numbers, so I'm perfectly happy with that. Getting in closer, the detail on the dialing and the texturing looks great. Look, I'm not a moon phase guy, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think the moon phase implementation, at least that I can see so far on the Datora, looks fantastic. It looks really considered. And across the board, I'm kind of shocked at how legible these watches are. They seem to be way better than a lot of much more modern and theoretically better designed, better human factors incorporation modern chronographs. That's cool. The simple font choices are fantastic. There are similar watches to this kind of kicking around that are big into using those Breguet numbers, which I really don't like. They tend to make watches feel, again, I'm going to use another word, stodgy. Just the simpler, more modern fonts, I think really do make this watch a lot cooler and fit in with the idea that we're trying to make something casual. On that note, I've got to say, I'm not 100% sold on kind of the old-fashioned font they've used on some of the modern names, Datora and Duograph. I'm not saying I hate it, but I know I don't love it. It'll be interesting to see how I feel about this moving forward. Moving from the dial, the cases all look really nicely detailed and finished, as typically for Breitling cases. They do look a bit fat on the Datora and the Duograph. That could just be, they are thick watches. We'll talk about the size later. They're a little bit over 15 mils. But it's also, I think from the profile view, that domed crystal, especially combined with the really, really short lugs, does make the case look pretty stubby. I would note, however, that some of the pics seem to feature female models or guys with pretty small wrists. So maybe that was just, again, it's one of these issues of compromise. A compromise Breitling was prepared to make in order to increase the wearability of these watches. I love the now long-standing traditional, if 3 years counts as a long-standing tradition, the long-standing traditional lines on the side of the case. Hey, listen, I know it's a pretty cheap and simple kludge to break up that sort of what could be a bit of a slab-sided case, but I'll take some modicum of effort to break up that slab side in a world where a lot of watchmakers selling watches a lot more expensive than this will just give me this big featureless wall of steel. So whilst I fully acknowledge it's a bit of a cheat, just those three little lines down the side of the case, at least they even made the effort. Finally, talking about the common stuff, I just think they got the crown and the pusher designs spot on, and they really suit the context here. That does seem to have worked really quite well. Okay, so that's all the common stuff. Now let's get down into the Premier. Let's get down into the individual watches. Start with the Premier, which is the simplest. I think it's the prettiest, and it is probably my favorite. It's a manual wind time and chronograph, no date, thank God, COSC certified 70-hour power reserve, fully in-house movement. It's only 40 millimeters across and 13 and a bit millimeters thick, and it comes with 100 meters water resistance. So that's a pretty sporty set of specs. I think that's something that you'd be pretty happy with. At the moment, it comes on in two varieties. A color they're calling pistachio, that kind of not quite mint, but a little bit pastelized green, which I love. So the pistachio on steel and silver on red gold. A little bit under 8.5K US on steel, a little bit over 20K US in red gold. Based on the photos, and I really have to emphasize all of this is just based on photos, I want this watch. When I first saw it, I wasn't sure. It did grab my attention, and I was thinking it was a watch I wanted to spend more time at. One of the benefits of this, of running a YouTube channel, is you're kind of, if you're going to do a video like this, you're kind of required to pay a little bit more attention to things and dig into them. Sometimes that means you end up not liking a watch that you previously might have liked. In this case, it's kind of meant that a watch I was interested in has turned into a watch I'm really interested in. Across the board, I think that light pastel-y green super works. It's kind of like, I know they didn't do green back in this era of the 40s and 50s, but I feel, even if I'm wrong, I feel like this is, if they did use green, this is the green it would be. It just works so harmoniously here. Anyway, so that's the basic chronograph. Now let's move into the Premier Duograph. It's a manual wind as well. Time split seconds chrono. No date again. COSC certified. 70-hour power reserve. Fully in-house movement. That's a pretty sporty set of specs. 42 millimeter watch. So it's getting on a bit. 15.35 millimeters thick and 100 meters water resistance. That is thicker than I would like. I'll be honest, I wish it was thinner than that. On the other hand, again, we're in this compromise space of, we'll talk about price later, but essentially, cut to the chase, we're talking around about 10 grand US. Money, thickness, and water resistance are kind of locked in this triangle. Want more of one or less of one, and you end up having to give up somewhere else. I'm glad they didn't make it more expensive. I'm really a big fan of getting 100 meters water resistance. So if that means I have to have a slightly chunkier watch, Look, it's not the compromise I want to make, but of the options, that's what I'd give up. Comes in two color schemes, blue on steel and black on red gold. As I said before, you're talking at around about a little bit over 10k US on steel and a little bit under 23k US in red gold. Here, unusually for me, I'm a big fan of the gold. Look, I usually find black and gold a bit crass. I really don't like, for example, the gilt dials like the Tudor 58. The Black Bay Tudor Black Bay 58. It gets this, for me, black and gold has this kind of 1970s John Player special, shitty cigarette smoke and bad makeup kind of feel. It's a color combination that just evokes so many bad kind of connotations for me. But in this case, the red gold, I think, turns it around and makes it something I'm interested in. I reckon I've stared at the screen for about 15 minutes trying to figure out what it is. And I'm convinced it's the red gold that I'm sort of locking in on here. And I suppose what I'm thinking is every product, car, watch, handbag, pair of shoes, kind of has this three zones of life. There's the nice, shiny, happy and new. And then there's the well and truly worn in, become classic vintage. And then between it, there's that awkward phase of it's just old. For me, what the red gold is doing is kind of pushing the watch out of this ever feeling old phase. Sometimes I look at it and it looks really new and sparkly and really exciting. Sometimes I look at the same watch and it makes me think of some sort of classic vintage that I would just love to be part of. But it never looks old and dowdy. And I think that's why, for me, the red gold and black is working. The final watch in this collection, in this release, is the Premier Datora. This is an automatic time with chronograph and day, date, month, moon phase. Again, all COSC certified. In this instance, only 48 hours power reserve, and this is what they call a manufacture, not an in-house movement. It originally comes from a movement house in Switzerland called Concepto, which means it can't be in-house. But on the other hand, Breitlings say that they've specified and designed their own modifications, passed those and had a specific version built for them. In industry speak, that seems to be what it means to be a manufacturer. 42 millimeters across, it is 15.35 millimeters thick and 100 meters water resistance. Those numbers might sound familiar. They're the same as the duograph, and I do wonder if they share a case. I did some more digging. The movements are actually quite different in thickness. One's about 2 millimeters thicker than the other. So I have a suspicion that they've actually just reused the case and then padded out the difference, which is a bit disappointing. That would tend to indicate one of those could have got a bit narrower, could have got a bit thinner. Comes in two varieties, as they all do right now, steel with a copper dial and red gold with a silver dial. You're talking at around about 13k US for the steel and 25,650 US on gold. For me, this is, well, the first thing I'd say is I can't really give a preference for this, and I'll tell you why. Because this is a watch which I think is absolutely beautiful and I would love to admire in the metal on someone else's wrist or perhaps in my hand, because it is truly beautiful. I look at this and I've got almost nothing bad to say. There's a lot going on, but it's not cluttered. Nothing smudges together and there's no overlaps. Everything is clean and clear. Despite how much is going on the dial, it's all balanced and everything's where it's supposed to be. And yet, it's still not a watch for me. I look at it and I think, I'm not a moon phase guy. The triple calendar feels a bit too fussy and a bit too much like hard work. So if a friend of mine was to buy this, I would spend an awful lot of time admiring it. And that would be great because I actually have no intention, I have no desire to ever own it. This watch has been really fun for me in a way, in that it's actually been one of the very first watches I've really paid a lot of attention to and dived into and enjoyed the idea of diving into, even though I have no intention of owning it, even though I wouldn't even want to own it if I could. That's been quite a revelatory kind of discovery for me. That's not normally how I feel. Normally, if I'm not interested in owning a watch, I become uninterested in the watch. This one's been a bit different. Okay, so that's my take on these watches. What's yours? The colors, I understand. Some of them might be a bit polarizing, especially that green. As much as I love it, I know people will want to see other things. Rest assured, there will be other colors coming, I think, for all of the watches. If there is anything you'd particularly like to see, let us know. I'd be really curious. If you wish they'd made the compromises that I spoke about differently, made it thinner but only given us like 30 meters water resistance or other sorts of things, what would you like? What choices would you have preferred they make? Anyway, as I said, I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches, and I'll see you later. Bye.